it's very important as we have our discussions through the rest of the semester that you understand the concept of elasticity. Now, elasticity, while the concept itself is simple, can have some very sophisticated implications in the economy. And so let's start with the most simple form of elasticity, which is the elasticity of demand. Now, the elasticity of demand is based on the slope of the curve of the demand curve, and if it were supply, of the supply curve. The equation that we use in its simplest form is the change in quantity over the quantity demanded divided by the change in the price over the price. And this formula then is the basic linear curve that we have in our supply and demand curve. Now, the elasticity of demand then would determine how we would make a choice about whether or not we would continue to buy something if the price goes up or the price goes down. If, for example, the elasticity of demand is completely horizontal, that means that if the price goes up or goes down, even a penny, nobody will buy that product, or they will buy all of the product. So if it goes up by a penny above that price, nobody will buy any of that product. Of course, if it's below that price, every unit of that product will be purchased. A horizontal demand curve is not possible. However, there might be portions of the demand curve that are horizontal. Now, what might affect this elasticity? Well, the first thing would be substitutes. So, are there substitutes for this good? Well, obviously, if we take something like brand A butter versus brand B butter, you probably don't care because it's some unknown brand. You go to the grocery store, it says brand A, no one says brand B. So to you, they're identical. And so if one of them is a penny cheaper, you buy that one. Because why wouldn't you? They're identical. On the other hand, if you find brand A butter and some big name brand butter, I don't know, Irish butter or something, you might say, oh, I really like that butter, it's better. And you might be willing to pay extra for the brand, some brand of butter versus brand A. People do this all the time because they perceive that there's greater value there. So substitutes make a big difference. Now, what if something doesn't have a substitute? Take something like insulin. Well, there are substitutes for insulin, but they're not very good ones. There's no perfect substitutes. And if you have type 1 diabetes, you need insulin. And so if the price of insulin goes up $1 or $2, you're going to still buy your insulin. At some price, $1 billion or whatever, you're not going to buy your insulin anymore. You're going to find a substitute. And what would be a substitute for insulin? Well, it could be a very strict diet. It's not great, but it's better than paying $1 billion. So there is always some kind of substitute, or it seems that there is, but the more difficult it is to find a perfect substitute or even a close substitute will make something more inelastic. The better the substitutes, the more elastic. The fewer the substitutes, the more inelastic. Another example would be necessities versus luxuries. So necessities like food, got to have food. So food's going to be very inelastic. Whereas a luxury, something like yachts, well, yachts are going to be much more elastic. Well, the price of yachts goes up enough, I might decide, well, instead of a yacht, I'm going to buy a private plane, or I'll buy my yacht somewhere else. So necessities tend to be very inelastic, and luxuries tend to be very elastic. Another thing that drives elasticity is time. So think about in the short run, things are going to be more inelastic. Why? Because it's harder to find a substitute or to create a substitute. If I said to you, well, the price of gasoline just went up by $4 a gallon or $10 a gallon. Why? Because of some tax that was put on it. You might say, well, I guess I'm still going to have to buy some gasoline because I have a job I have to get to. But I'm really unhappy about this. So in the short run, you might continue to buy some gasoline. But in the long run, you might decide, well, I'm going to move closer to my job. Or you might say, well, I'm going to ride a bicycle, so I'll buy a bicycle. Or you might say, I'm going to take public transportation. So in the long run, we'll find substitutes, but in the short run, we won't. So you can also see this, for example, in labor. So you could say, well, they raised the price of the minimum wage, and now it costs employers more to hire people. In the short run, they might continue to keep those employees. Why? Because they have to keep their business running. But what do you think they're going to be doing for the long run? They're going to be looking for a substitute for that labor. And that's going to be something like a technology. So grocery stores are going to be looking for automated self-checkout lines. Another category is narrow versus broad markets. Very narrow markets tend to be more elastic. So brand A butter would be about as narrow as you can get. The category of butter, on the other hand, is a little broader than brand A butter, so it's going to be a little more inelastic. And food is going to be really broad. It's going to be very inelastic. So as we broaden the market, as we make it wider, we're going to find that there's greater inelasticity. As we narrow the market, there's going to be greater elasticity. Now, these are the major categories that determine elasticity. Let's then apply this same concept to the supply curve. The elasticity of supply would be the slope of the supply curve. Now, the supply curve, the equation for that is going to be very similar to the equation for the demand curve, and that is the change in the quantity supplied divided by the quantity supplied. That all divided by the change in price divided by the price. And what might then affect the elasticity of supply? Well, one example would be the structures of production. So if the structures of production change, requiring you to invest more, to use different inputs, and so forth, that could affect your supply elasticity or the elasticity of any supply depending on that structure of production. If, for example, you make automobiles, that supply chain is very long. You have to have steel. The steel has to be formed into the shapes for the automobiles. You have to have paints. There have to be chemicals that are put together to make those paints. You have to have plastics. There have to be molds that have to be made. You have to start working on a new design for a car years and years ahead of time. You can't just suddenly come out with a new car. So in the short run, we're going to see more inelasticities. But again, in the long run, we're going to see greater elasticity. So the structures of production, the inputs, and time are the two key aspects of elasticity of supply.